Have you ever spent a night at a campground in the rain and ended up with a flooded tent and a wet sleeping bag? It's happened to me. When it does happen to us, it's usually not too much of a big deal. We can retreat to our car, we can go to a motel, we can drive back home, and it gives us a funny story to tell and laugh about. But if something like that happens to us when we're trying to hike hundreds of miles on the Appalachian Trail, we might not find it very funny. If it happens to us on the Appalachian Trail, it's not going to be easy to retreat to civilization, and we might have to wait 3 or 4 days until we have sun warm enough to dry all our stuff. When we're at those campgrounds, we can use almost any kind of tent and get by more or less, but on the Appalachian Trail, we need a shelter that will not let us down when heavy rain strikes. And heavy rain will strike on the Appalachian Trail. I've seen torrential downpours on the AT, and I also once spent 48 hours hiking through and sleeping through pretty much non-stop rain and drizzle. Many of us believe it is a good idea to pay attention to the weight we are carrying on the Appalachian Trail, and for that reason, light options like tarps are very popular among experienced AT hikers. So we are going to take a look at shelter options on the Appalachian Trail with an emphasis on keeping us and our sleeping gear protected from rain. So we're going to look at tarps, we're going to look at tarp tents, or what might be called shaped tarps, or tarp tent hybrids, and we're going to look at commercially made tents. It can help us to keep in mind that the weight of the shelter we carry can affect other elements of our packing system. For example, if we use a tent that is heavy, that weighs 4 or 5 pounds, that can affect the pack we have to carry. Some light packs have a weight limit that can only carry so many pounds. If we use a heavy tent, we might have to use a pack that weighs 4 or 5 pounds empty. And on the other hand, if we use a shelter that is light, we might get by with a pack that weighs only 1 or 2 pounds empty. Also, it's very popular for many good reasons to use a down sleeping bag on the Appalachian Trail, but the down sleeping bag must be protected from rain under all circumstances. If a down sleeping bag gets quite wet, it's going to be very difficult to dry it out. And for a down sleeping bag to be warm, it has to be dry or nearly completely dry. So let's talk about tarps first. I have spent time under tarps. For example, this pathetic looking specimen here, and this one here. There are many ways to pitch a tarp using ropes and guy lines stretched all over the place to poles, to trees, and you can have a lot of fun experimenting with that. But on the Appalachian Trail, I would only pitch a tarp one way, and that is the way we see one pitched here. A tarp that is pitched low to the ground like this will tend to give us the maximum amount of protection from the rain because rain doesn't always fall straight down. Sometimes it's accompanied by gusty wind that will move the rain around. Also, when we have a tarp pitched like this one is with 4 or 5 stakes and only one guy line, it's easy to find a place to pitch the tarp, and the tarp can be pitched fairly quickly. For reasons that I hope are obvious, we want to reduce, or if possible, eliminate the chance that wind will blow into our tarp. In order to do that, we often have to pay very close attention to which way the wind is blowing, and if we make a mistake and have the wind blowing into the tarp, we might not like the result. I have made that kind of mistake in the past, and it's a mistake I'm not eager to repeat. So, what we see here, a tarp pitched down to the ground with stakes on 3 sides gives us at least a 75% chance that the wind will not blow into the opening of the tarp because the tarp only has one open side. For those who don't know, you can buy a tarp designed for backpacking. They are not very heavy, and you can usually buy one for a reasonable price. As I speak, the Campmore website has a 9 by 9 foot coated nylon tarp. It weighs about 1 pound, 7 ounces, and it costs $45. And if I was going to use a tarp extensively on the Appalachian Trail, a tarp 9 feet by 9 feet would be my first choice. I think that's just about right for one person. It would cover that person and their sleeping gear. It would also have some room to bring your pack inside under the tarp. What we're looking at here actually is a poncho. It is 56 inches wide by 102 inches long, and that's more than 8 feet. The opening, of course, is one of the long sides. Inside is a ridge rest sleeping pad. That ridge rest is 20 inches wide. That means that the width of the tarp is more than twice the width of the ridge rest, which will allow us to move the ridge rest toward the back to make sure we're nicely covered as we sleep. It's set up with a trekking pole that is 3 feet tall. The pole goes through a loop cord goes over the top of the pole, that goes to a stake, and this is tall enough for me to be able to sit up inside near the front of the tarp. If I had, say, an 8x10 tarp, I would make the open end one of the narrow edges of the tarp as opposed to the wide edge we see with this poncho. Some long-distance hikers on the Appalachian Trail do not carry a shelter, but instead they count on staying in one of the wooden shelters or lean-tos up and down the AT. The AT has more than 250 of these wooden shelters and lean-tos. Some people who use this approach will carry a poncho and use that poncho as a shelter if for some reason they can't make it to a shelter by nightfall. A nylon tarp, like a silicone impregnated nylon tarp or a coated nylon tarp, would be my first choice for a good combination of lightweight and low cost, but there does exist a thing called Cuben fiber, spelled C-U-B-E-N, that is a fairly recent development in outdoor products. This fiber is very light and it is very expensive. Online I found one tarp that weighed 7 ounces, but it cost $255. Those who use hammocks also tend to use tarps to cover their hammock. A hammock is a very interesting idea because you don't need level ground to pitch one. You do, however, need trees. So far, I haven't felt the need to try to use a hammock on the Appalachian Trail. This is an example of a tarp tent. This one has a single wall, it has no floor, and it's very similar to using a tarp, except you don't have to pay quite as much attention to which way the wind is blowing. You can sleep in one of these with the door completely open if you like, and the experience would be similar to sleeping under a tarp. This particular model was made by Integral Designs, and it is called a sill shelter. It is no longer manufactured, but you can buy other tarp tents that are very similar to this in design. In the description, I will put some links to some of these tarp tents so you can take a look. With both tarp and tarp tent, it often takes a little thought to get a tight pitch when you put the thing up. Integral Designs, if they still exist, no longer sell the sill shelter, and one reason for that, I think, might be the fact that some people complained that the sill shelter would droop when they tried to pitch it. I have used mine a great deal, and it was very easy to get this thing to pitch tight. All I had to do was pull the front stake toward the door out tight. That pulled the entire thing taut, and it would pitch tight as you see it here, as you see it here, and as you see it here. If we put up a tarp like this, the thing to do is first put in the 2 stakes in the back, then put the pole in, pull the guy line tight, and then adjust the 2 remaining corners to get a tight pitch. It's also true that any nylon shelter will tend to sag if it gets soaking wet. Both the tarp and the sill shelter use a trekking pole to hold them up. When the shelter gets wet, it's no big deal to extend the pole a little bit more, and that will take the sag out of a wet tarp or a wet tarp tent. Condensation is an issue that concerns some people when it comes to tarp and tarp tents, but on the Appalachian Trail, condensation is not your real enemy. Your real enemy is pounding rain that continues for hour after hour. Condensation can be minimized in a tarp if we have one side open like this. It can be minimized in a tarp tent if the door is kept open. I would suggest that every Appalachian Trail hiker carry 2 or 3 bandanas. If they do get condensation, it can easily be cleaned up with a bandana. I can also tell you that when I have had to use a bandana on the AT on a tarp tent, it's usually been on the outside when morning dew has condensed. Only rarely have I had to use one to wipe off condensation off the inside of a tarp tent. When it comes to commercial tents, it seems that there is a direct connection between the weight of the tent and the price of the item. And by that, I mean if we buy a single-person backpacking tent that weighs 3 or more pounds, it's often possible to get one that costs less than $150. On the other hand, if we want to buy one that is less than 2 pounds, the cost tends to increase quite a bit. I got on the internet looking for the lightest single-person backpacking tents I could find. I found a Marmot Nitro 1. It weighs 1 pound 15 ounces. It costs $280. I found a Mountain Hardwear Super Mega Ultralight 1. It weighs 2 pounds 3 ounces. It costs $300. I found a Big Agnes Fly Creek 1 Ultralight. It weighs 2 pounds 1 ounce, and that costs $330. The websites I found showed that the Mountain Hardwear and Big Agnes could be made even lighter by using an optional footprint instead of the meshed tent body that would go under the Fly. However, you're going to have to buy those optional footprints separately, and that will mean more money. There are a couple of factors to consider when using any tarp tent or commercial tent. For example, can you bring your gear with you into the shelter and out of the rain? Another consideration is how much square footage will the shelter occupy. Wooden shelters on the Appalachian Trail usually have some tent sites nearby. I have seen some of these prepared tent sites that would just barely hold a 7 by 9 foot tent. If you have one that takes up all the room, you might have trouble finding a place to pitch it. Some people who sleep under tarps will use a thing called a bivy sack. The idea behind the bivy sack is you put your sleeping bag inside, and the bivy sack will protect your sleeping bag from moisture. Many bivy sacks work poorly. I would not trust one unless it is of high quality, and that would mean it would cost a lot of money. They also add weight. I think the optimum choice overall is to select a shelter that provides enough coverage that a bivy sack is not needed in the first place. Others apparently agree with me. I've never seen another hiker on the AT with a bivy sack. What about the flooding issue that we started off with? Tents that flood are going to look like this. They will have a single wall of floor, often made out of plastic, and a fly that is so small that it will not completely cover the tent. None of the backpacking options we have talked about have those liabilities. That's it. We're done. Thanks a lot for watching.